Wyoming Territory, October 1879. The first snow had come early, dry and sharp like powdered glass, covering the fields around the Zeller homestead in a hush that made the world feel too quiet. Margaret Zeller was used to silence. It had been her companion since her husband died 2 winters ago, just after laying the foundation for the barn that now stood finished, thanks to her own 2 hands and a stubborn streak that refused to bend. She had not expected to find a man bleeding out on the straw-covered floor. It was just past dawn when she heard a horse snort strange, because her own gelding had died the week before, and she had not replaced him. Margaret grabbed the rifle from above the door and stepped into the barn, boots crunching over frost-hardened earth. A man lay slumped beside the feed bins, his coat soaked in blood from a gunshot high in his side. His face was pale beneath the dirt, beard unkempt, eyes closed. His revolver had slipped from his hand. His horse, a dusty roan, stood nearby, reins tangled in a rake handle. Margaret moved slow, rifle aimed. "You alive?" The man's lashes fluttered. "Ma'am," he rasped. "You planning on dying in my barn?" He gave the smallest shake of his head. "Tried not to." Margaret narrowed her eyes, lowering the rifle just an inch. His voice was hoarse but steady, and his eyes, when they opened, held no panic, just pain and something else, something old and worn. He did not look like a man with much left to lose. "You a criminal?" "Yes, ma'am," he said without hesitation. Used to be. He coughed, blood flecking his lip. "Got out. Too late, maybe." Margaret hesitated. She should have turned him in. She should have dragged him to the sheriff in town if he lived that long. Instead, she laid the rifle on the hay bale and knelt beside him. "I'm not going to let you bleed to death," she said. "But if you try anything, I will shoot you myself. I believe you." It took nearly an hour to clean the wound and stitch it, her fingers raw from scrubbing and shaking. She had not used her husband's old medical kit since the cholera took their son. She had not touched it since the fever took her husband 1 week later. But her hands remembered. Her hands did not shake when they held the needle. By the time she finished, the man had passed out from the pain. She covered him with a horse blanket, built a fire in the corner stove, and fed the roan a handful of oats. Then she sat on a stool and watched the man breathe. He woke in the afternoon. His cheeks were flushed, fever already coming on. She fed him water with a tin cup. He drank, eyes tracking her. "Name's Callum," he whispered. "Callum Carter." "Margaret Zeller," she said. He gave a faint nod. "I know that name. Your husband was Daniel Zeller. Fought at Shiloh." Margaret stiffened. "That was years ago. I knew him. Not well. Just knew his name. He was a good man." She did not answer. She pressed a wet cloth to his forehead. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I was heading north," Callum said. "Got caught in the open. Some men I used to ride with, one of them got lucky. So you were running. I am leaving it behind. There is a difference." She looked at him again, harder this time. His jaw was rough with days of growth. His hands were scarred but not shaking. He was not a boy. He looked maybe 35, a few years older than she was. He had the look of a man who had done things he could not forget and was tired of remembering them. "You should sleep," she said. He did. That night, Margaret stood outside the barn, listening to the wind move through the trees. She had lived alone for over 2 years. She had buried her son, her husband, and her hope in the same patch of frozen earth behind the house. She had not let herself feel more than what was needed to survive. But now there was a dying man in her barn, and she had chosen not to let him die. In the morning, she brought him coffee in a tin mug. He was awake, sitting against the wall, face pale but alert. "You know you probably saved my life," he said. "You are still bleeding through your bandages," she replied, setting the mug down beside him. "I have land." She frowned. "What?" Callum reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with blood. He handed it to her. She opened it slowly. It was a deed. 160 acres in Montana Territory. Signed and registered. I bought it last year. Started building a cabin. It is good land. Fresh spring trees, not too far from Fort Benton. So, I cannot go back there alone. Not anymore. I was heading there to start over. If I die, it goes to no one. Her throat tightened. Why are you telling me this? I am offering it to you. Margaret stared at him. You do not know me. I know you saved a man you should have left to die. I know you have not asked for anything in return. She folded the deed and shoved it back into his hand. I do not want your land. Callum looked at her, steady and quiet. Then let me live long enough to give it to you properly. She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest, not from fear, but from something she had not felt in a long time, something she did not yet have a name for. I need to change your bandages, she said. Callum smiled, just barely. Yes, ma'am. And so she did. Carefully, her hands firm but gentle. He winced but did not complain. When she was done, he caught her wrist lightly. Thank you, he said, voice low. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, warmth stirred deep in her chest. You are not dying in my barn, Callum Carter, she said. Not today. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark listening to the wind skitter dry leaves across the porch, and when she finally rose, her body felt as though it had been carved from the frost-laced ground itself. The stove in the main room had long gone out. She lit a new fire with careful hands, the kindling catching with a reluctant pop. She baked cornbread in the iron pan and brewed chicory in the dented kettle. The rhythm of it steadied her, but her thoughts kept circling back to the man in her barn. As dawn edged over the hills, pale light broke across the wheat stubble and touched the frost glass of the windows. She carried a bowl of food and the coffee out, her shawl drawn tight against the cold. Callum was awake, propped against the barn wall, his eyes clearer than they'd been the day before. He was pale, but the hard line of his jaw had returned. He looked toward her when the door creaked. You came back, he said. I live here. He nodded once. Still, wasn't sure you'd want to. She set the bowl on a crate. You need to eat. He reached for the spoon, slow but without trembling. Storm's coming, he said, glancing toward the high, bright edge of the sky. You can smell it? No. I can feel it in my ribs. They've been busted before. She leaned against the stall door, watching him eat. You said you were building a cabin. Started it in August. Got the walls up, roof halfway done. Chimney'll need finishing before snow sets in for good. You think you'll be well enough to travel by then? Depends how long you keep stitching me together. Margaret crossed her arms. You have any family out there? Neighbors? No family left. Closest neighbor's 7 miles off. Widow woman and her brother. They helped me raise the ridgepole. She studied his face, looking for something beneath the easy tone. Why'd you leave it? Callum finished a bite before answering. The man who shot me, his brother runs with a crew near the Snake. I was told they'd moved on. They hadn't. You brought danger here. I didn't mean to. I thought I'd lost them. Margaret's jaw tensed. You're sure they didn't follow you? I'm sure. I doubled back twice. They'd have caught me if they were close. She reached for the empty mug and refilled it from the tin flask she carried out. He took it, nodding his thanks. Why didn't you stay and finish the cabin before winter? She asked. Thought I could fetch supplies from Casper. Wasn't planning to get shot along the way. Margaret hesitated, rubbing her thumb against a dry patch of skin on her knuckle. You said the land was yours. Bought proper. Every acre. Paid with wages I earned driving cattle up from Texas. Legal and recorded. She looked at him, quiet for a long breath. You really offering it to me? I don't make promises I can't keep. Margaret crouched beside the stove and tossed in another hunk of wood. The warmth spread slow, but it was enough to ease the bite from the air. She didn't speak for a while, watching the fires flicker against the barn walls. I had a boy, she said finally. Eli. He was 6. He liked to feed the chickens even when it was near dark. Callum didn't interrupt. His eyes stayed on hers, steady. One night he didn't come back. I found him curled up behind the coop, breathing hard. Fever took him in 3 days. She stood, brushing hay dust from her skirt. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Daniel built this place with his hands. Buried them both by the cottonwood. I thought staying meant I still had something of them. Callum's voice was rough when he spoke. Maybe you did. She turned to face him. Maybe I did. But now I've got nothing here that breathes. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't need to. The barn was quiet except for the crackle of the small fire and the sound of the roan shifting in its stall. I don't know what kind of man you were before, she said. I was the kind who made too many wrong choices for too long. You said you changed. I'm trying. Doesn't wipe the slate, but it's something. She walked to the door, pausing before stepping out into the thin light. If you're serious about that cabin, I want to see it before snow comes for good. If you're lying, you won't make it that far anyway. I'm not lying. She didn't look back. We'll see. Callum was standing the next day, though barely. Margaret found him leaning against the edge of the stall, one hand pressed to his side, the other braced on the rail. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his breath came hard, but he didn't look like he intended to lie down again. You're going to tear your stitches, she said, setting the pail of fresh water near the door. I can't lie still another day, he said without looking over. I need to move or I'll start thinking about things that'll do me worse than this wound. She stepped beside him, arms crossed. You think walking around my barn's going to fix your past? I know it won't, he said, voice low. But it might remind me I've still got a body that works. Margaret didn't answer. She walked past him, grabbed the broom from the corner, and started sweeping the straw away from the feed bins. The scrape of bristles against the packed dirt filled the silence. After a while, she handed it to him. If you can stand, you can sweep. He took it without protest, moving slow. His movements were stiff, but steady, and he didn't complain when the pain caught him. They worked in silence until the floor was clear, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of horses. Later, they sat outside beneath the cottonwoods. The light filtered through thinning leaves. Callum's coat hung loose around his shoulders, patched and worn. Margaret had brought out a small tin of salve and a pair of shears. You let that hair get any longer, it'll start nesting birds, she said, lifting the shears. He huffed once. You plan on shearing me like a sheep? No, she said. Just enough to make you look like someone who might own land. She worked in silence, the blades clicking gently. His hair fell in soft clumps onto his collar. When she was done, she handed him the salve. For the skin behind your ears. It's cracked. I'm not used to being cared for. I'm not in the habit of doing it. He looked at her, his gaze calm. But here we are. Margaret didn't speak. She picked up the fallen hair and tossed it into the fire pit beside the house. When she returned, he hadn't moved. What were you before whatever you became? She asked, sitting beside him on the bench. Farmhand. Then scout. Then I got good at gambling. That was the mistake. She glanced sideways. You gamble now? Not anymore. I carry a deck, but only to remind myself what it cost me. She rested her hands in her lap. What did it? Trust. A family I hadn't earned. A woman who thought she could change me. Margaret didn't press. The breeze stirred the branches overhead, and somewhere a hawk called once, long and thin. He turned toward her. You plan on staying here come winter? I was. But I'm thinking about that cabin of yours. You think you might take it? I think if you're strong enough to saddle up in a week, I might ride with you and see it for myself. He nodded once, slow. You'd be welcome to. They sat until the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of old linen. When she stood, he rose too, slower but without help. You're healing, she said. Because you let me. That doesn't mean I trust you. I wouldn't trust me yet either. Margaret looked up at him, her voice quiet. But I might want to. Callum didn't move, didn't reach for her, but something in his gaze softened. Then I'll keep giving you reason. She turned and walked toward the house, her steps sure. She didn't close the barn door that night. She left it open just wide enough to let the light from the kitchen window reach the straw floor. The wagon hadn't moved in over a year. When Margaret stepped into the lean-to beside the shed, she found mice had nested under the seat and one wheel looked bowed from damp. She hauled out the wool blankets from the back, gave them a firm shake, and set them across the porch rail to air. Then she fetched the repair tools, laid them out one by one, and got to work. By early afternoon, Callum appeared, walking slow but straight. He didn't ask what she was doing, just dropped to one knee beside the wheel and traced the crack in the spoke with his thumb. "You know what you're doing with this?" "I know how to make it move again." He glanced toward her hand where she held the rasp. "That grip says you've done this before." "My father was a wheelwright back in Missouri." He nodded once, picked up the hatchet, and split a length of drywood from the pile. "Good, because I'd hate to die from a busted axle after all this." Margaret didn't smile, but her voice softened. "I'm not planning to let you die at all." They worked through the afternoon with few words. She trimmed a new wedge for the hub, and Callum fitted it in place, his hand steady despite the ache she could see behind his eyes. When the wheel was mended, she stepped back and wiped her palms on her apron. "You'll still need to rest it 2 more days. I don't want you tearing open that wound. I can ride before I can walk far. Saddle hold me steadier than this ground." She folded her arms. "We're not leaving until I say we're ready." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." They didn't speak again until supper. The table inside was plain, just pine, rough cut and worn to a satin by use, but she laid out 2 plates and poured stew from the pot she'd kept simmering all day. He sat across from her, clean-shaven now, hair cropped close to his neck. The change was subtle, but it made him look more like a man who'd built something and less like one who'd lost everything. "You said you had no kin," she said, breaking bread in half. "I had a brother once. Younger. He died in Kansas, trying to hold a claim that wasn't worth the stone it sat on." She looked up from her bowl. "You were close." "No. But we should have been." Margaret chewed slowly. "I had 2 sisters. One married into a church family in Illinois. The other drowned when we were girls. After that, we all kept our grief quiet." Callum set his spoon down. "You ever hear from the one in Illinois?" "No. She wrote once after Daniel passed. I never answered." He didn't ask why, and she didn't explain. When the meal was done, she cleared the table while he brought in wood from the stack. The quiet between them had changed, no longer full of weight, but space. They moved around each other with a closeness that hadn't been spoken, only built. Later, she found him on the porch bench, sharpening the blade of his old pocket knife. She joined him with 2 tin cups of warm cider. "You plan to bring that blade with you when we go?" He looked at the metal in his hands. "It's the only thing I've carried since Texas. Not because it's useful, because it reminds me I'm still trying." She took a sip. "Trying to be what?" "Someone who can build something that lasts." The wind stirred the branches above, sending a dry rustle across the sky. The stars had begun to show, cold and bright. "You think your land's worth that effort?" she asked. "I think there's nothing worth more than a place you can walk barefoot without fear." Margaret stared into the dark, the cider warm in her hands. "There's a part of me that still hears my son's footsteps on the porch, and I don't know if I can leave that behind." Callum didn't shift. "Then don't. Bring it with you. Bring him. Bring Daniel. Bring everything that made you survive this long." She turned her head, her voice barely above the wind. "You want me to come with you?" "I do. And not because I need help finishing the chimney." Her breath caught, just once, before she set her cup down and stood. "We leave in 3 days," she said. "That's when the moon'll be full enough to ride by if we need to." Callum looked up at her, and in the porch light, something unguarded passed between them. "I'll be ready." She didn't answer, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was walking alone back into the house. They left on a morning cold enough to sting the lungs. Frost laid silver across the fields that once bore wheat. Margaret tied a strip of muslin around the latch of the front door, not to secure it, but to mark it quiet goodbye, nothing more. The roan took the lead, reins looped through Callum's gloved hand, while the wagon followed behind, its wheels creaking gently beneath their weight and what little they had packed. The journey northward was slow. Margaret drove the wagon, hands firm on the reins, eyes scanning more than just the road. Callum rode beside, never far, his wound healing but not forgotten. The land widened as they moved, the hills smoothing into open flats, the wind carrying the scent of pine and cold stream water. They passed no towns, only the occasional trapper's fire smoke in the distance, and once a herd of elk crossing the river with the sure rhythm of a world that had never needed people to name it. They didn't speak often, there was little need. But when they did, the talk grew deeper, shaped by the shared silence around it. "You ever thought of leaving the territory altogether?" she asked as they camped by the Stillwater, her fingers red from scrubbing the supper pots clean with snow. "I did," he said, not looking up from where he fed kindling into the fire. "But each time I put my boots toward the border, something pulled me back." "What was it?" "I think I just wanted to build something that wouldn't vanish when I stopped watching it." Margaret crouched beside him, holding her hands to the flames. "I used to think that too. That if I worked hard enough, I could keep everything from falling apart." He handed her a strip of jerky, warm from his coat pocket. "Maybe we were just looking in the wrong direction." The last leg of the trip took them into thick timber, where the sun thinned to pale gold through the spruce. When they reached Callum's land, it was nearly dusk. The cabin stood half-formed, timbers fitted tight, roof pitched but open at the ridgeline. Snow had dusted the floorboards inside where wind slipped through the gaps. Margaret stepped down from the wagon and walked the perimeter without a word. The land sloped gentle toward a spring-fed creek. A stand of birch clustered along the edge, white trunks catching the late light. The place had a quiet to it, not the hollow kind, but one that waited for voices, for footsteps, for life to take hold. "This is good land," she said, glancing back toward him. "I hoped you'd think so." She moved to the cabin's open front, her boots crunching over frost-laced earth. "We'll need a stove before the month turns. I can trade the roan for one in Fort Benton." "You won't. That horse carried you here." "We'll find another way." He watched her a moment, something easing in his shoulders. "You already thinking in we?" "I suppose I am." They spent the first 2 weeks building. Callum handled the heavier labor, though Margaret never let him lift beyond what his ribs could bear. She laid shingles, chinked gaps with moss and clay, hung a scrap of oilcloth over the single window until they could afford glass. At night, they slept rolled in blankets beside the hearth pit, sharing heat and the kind of nearness that asked for nothing but gave everything. One morning, while Margaret boiled beans over the fire, Callum approached with a bundle in his hands. He unwrapped it carefully, a cast-iron skillet, polished and whole. "I traded my old pocket knife and half a day's work for it," he said. She took it from him, fingers brushing his. "Then I suppose I'll have to make something worth it." He didn't step back. "I'm not offering you a life of ease, Margaret, just one of steadiness." "I never wanted ease," she said. "I wanted someone who'd stand beside me when the wind came hard." He reached for her hand. "Then let the wind come." That night, they laid together under wool and stars, her head tucked beneath his jaw, his hand resting over hers. No vows were spoken. None were needed. By the time spring softened the creek's edges and green began to rise through the thaw, the cabin stood complete. They built a table from pine, carved their initials beneath it on a day when the clouds broke just long enough to let sunlight spill through the window. Margaret planted beans and onions behind the cabin, and Callum built a smokehouse from riverstone. They shared the work without dividing it by pride. When they argued, it was quiet and brief and always ended with one of them reaching across the space between. One afternoon, as the creek rushed high with meltwater and the birches unfurled their first leaves, Margaret stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Callum stack the last of the cutwood. "You ever wonder what they'd think?" she asked. He turned, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Who?" "Daniel. Eli. Your brother." He nodded slowly. "I think they'd say we didn't waste what was left." She stepped down, took his hand. "No. We didn't." They walked the edge of the field together, boots sinking into damp earth, the sky above wide and open. Years passed. The land held steady. A second cabin rose not far from the first, built with care for the child who arrived one October morning with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet strength. They named her Clara. They never spoke about the life before, not because it was forgotten, but because it had shaped them into the hands that held each other now. The past was not buried. It was part of the soil, the timber, the breath of wind that moved through the trees. Each night, when the fire burned low and Clara curled against her mother's side, Callum would wrap an arm around them both and listen to the steady hush of the wind beyond the walls they built together. They had earned peace, not through luck, but through the long work of trust and the quiet courage of choosing it every day. And they never stopped choosing.